server or to be handed over to the operations team. Releasing and deploying that application and running it by the operations team mostly requires some kind of instructions because that application has some dependencies, it needs a certain configuration. For example, it needs some environmental variables, it needs a space or a folder on the system to log to. It could be any type of configuration that the application needs, or it may need a database, for example, with a certain configuration. So whatever it is, operations team has to prepare the server and the environment where the application runs before deploying that application. So in traditional software development process, in this ineffective process, what happens is the development team documents the instructions of how to deploy the application and then hands over the application, the built artifact of the application, together with the instructions of how to deploy that to the operations team. Operation team tries to follow the instructions to configure the application, to prepare the environment for deploying it. Usually and mostly this doesn't work because either the instructions are not clearly stated or it's just too much and something is missing because someone forgot to put something there and so on. So if this happens, the operations team will have a very hard time running the application and it may take weeks to make that happen. And because of that, many companies have release cycles, so to say, in their application development process that takes weeks or months. So whenever a new feature needs to be released, so to say, to the public, to the users, it may take up to a month or maybe multiple months for the operations team to actually make that happen. And because this is a big problem, a solution was needed for this miscommunication and solving the issue of having two completely separated, unrelated roles that couldn't communicate with each other or had a hard time communicating with each other and working with each other effectively. And that solution basically was the DevOps culture. Eventually, DevOps was just a concept, just a culture, a way of working between the developers and the IT operations. Now you probably already know DevOps engineer as a job title, but initially it was just a way of working to make sure the developers and IT operations found a common language to communicate with each other. And that culture eventually became its own role and job description because it started to encompass so many different concepts and also tools in order to enable that effective communication that soon people realized it could actually be its own dedicated person or a team because it would require a whole new set of competencies that neither developers nor operations could cover in their own roles. And that's how DevOps kind of evolved. So what does DevOps actually do and what is these roles, tasks and responsibilities? So by now you realize this is the intermediary person or team between developers and IT operations. So basically DevOps engineer has to have some of the competencies and technical know-how of the developer as well as IT operations. And this know-how then makes it much easier for them to understand how this handing over of the application should work the most effectively. So they have subset of skills on both sides, so to say. And this subset of skills make them able to communicate with both sides. So developers don't have to talk directly to operations, they can talk to DevOps because DevOps speak the same language. Because DevOps have a common language with the developers. As well as on the other side, DevOps has the common language with operations so they can kind of transfer that message to the operations much easier. However, and that is the reason why actually DevOps became its own thing, is that in addition to this subset of skills on both sides, DevOps has evolved to have its own specific unique skills and technical know-how on top of all that. And that skill set and know-how encompasses the DevOps tools that we know today. Most important, the core competency being building continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment pipelines to make the process of transitioning the ready application to the release process as well as some other technologies like Docker and Kubernetes to make the whole transitioning process even easier and more effective. So now that we've painted the whole picture and saw the evolvement and need for DevOps skills and some of its responsibilities, you should have a much better picture of how DevOps actually fits in the whole application development deployment process. Now, one thing that heavily influences the speed and the overall process of how software development and delivery actually happens inside an organization is the methodology or the way that organization is actually developing the applications. What do I mean by that? Traditionally, there was this concept or a methodology of developing software called a waterfall method. So waterfall basically would mean, again, if we go back to the example of Facebook, let's say if the team was developing Facebook from scratch, the very first features, they would make a plan of how the application or how the Facebook application would look like with a list of every possible feature, the messaging, events, creating groups and pages and uploading pictures. So basically every specific feature listed and documented. Then a development team would take that huge list of application features and their documentation of how the business people envisioned it and start developing one feature at a time. So developers would go for a month basically just coding and adding new features and new functionalities. And once the development process of the whole entire application was done, the application would then go to the testing department. So testing department would go through each and every feature one by one and test their functionality, do load testing, do performance testing, and so on. Of course, they would find some bugs or some mismatches, so to say, between the documentation and the execution or the implementation of the features. They would send those improvement tasks back to the development team. Development team would go through each one of the improvement tasks on the list. Again, takes a month to improve the application, transfer it to the testing department. They would go through the same cycle of testing everything. And obviously this would produce a couple of cycles. And once the testing and development was completed, they would push the application over to the operations saying, here's the application, it's tested, you can now deploy that. So operations team will create these huge preparation tasks and work a couple of months or maybe again years in order to prepare the infrastructure to run the whole application. Obviously, some problems would arise because some parts of the application wouldn't run. There will be, again, back and forth with the development team and so on. So maybe after a couple of years, the application was ready and deployed and running. Now, this may sound like a tedious, long, and very ineffective process, and it was and is in most of the cases, especially when developing such complex applications, especially considering that the application development or features may evolve over time based on new demands or maybe what the users want, etc. And obviously a lot of companies realized that this method was ineffective in a lot of ways because it created so many places of failure along the process and so many opportunities for miscommunications and misunderstandings between the teams and not allow for quick and fast feedback. So as an alternative to the waterfall method, a very extreme methodology was developed, which you probably heard of, which is called agile methodology for software development, which is actually pretty popular and is becoming increasingly popular across organizations and companies. And the main benefit or the thing that it solves is the speed of development, testing, and deploying cycles. So basically, instead of just waiting there to develop the whole application start to finish by checking off each feature and bug fix and so on, basically each new feature gets tested, deployed, and there's an immediate feedback if there is some bug in that feature or if the deployment doesn't work, etc. And the agile methodology actually allows for a more dynamic, fast, and also easily changeable development and deployment process. And since agile is just a methodology or a framework that just tells you, so to say, what are the good practices and efficient ways to do things, it has specific implementations of that framework. One of them being Scrum, and another one is Kanban. You probably also heard of them. And depending on the company and the team and their needs, they may be working with one of the frameworks. However, the important concept to take away here is that Agile basically is at the heart and at the core of the continuous integration and continuous delivery process, which has become the thing that a lot of companies strive towards in order to make their software development and delivery processes much more efficient. And the Agile methodology introduction or adoption in so many companies has actually supported the need for DevOps tasks, because DevOps is actually implementing the best practices or some of the best practices that Agile framework introduces. As I said, at the core of DevOps is continuous integration, continuous delivery, or deployment, in order to make sure that each feature and bug fix is released as fast as possible, as well as automation tools to make the process faster by replacing the human tasks with automated tools to make the process faster. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very high-level overview of how all these concepts fit together and how it all works as a big picture analysis so that you understand how this all comes together. Throughout this bootcamp, however, we will go and zoom in into each part of this cycle, so to say, and understand these parts in more detail and learn the concepts of continuous integration, continuous deployment, and so on along the way. And of course, learning all the concepts and tools necessary from the DevOps perspective.